My name is Erica Smith. I'm the Chief Business Officer of Cognivia, and I'm here today to tell you about Placebell, our tool that can be used to manage the placebo response in clinical trials. Of course, anyone who's involved in drug development knows that the placebo response is still an issue. And despite all the efforts that have been made over several decades, this continues to persist as a significant issue that causes trial failure. And one of the consequences of this is more patients need to be enrolled to overcome some of the difficulties related to the placebo response, which of course increases the cost and timeline of drug development. So we see the placebo response at Cognivia is really arising from differences between patients. So one of the easiest ways to think about this is to think about patients of different ages. So clinical trials, of course, will evaluate drugs in patients of different ages, and it's not unreasonable to think that the age of the patient will affect how that patient responds to treatment. So typically, the ages of the patients will exist in some spectrum. And the way statisticians deal with this differential response related to age is they apply age as a covariate in the statistical analysis. And essentially, what that does is mathematically reduce the difference in response that's related to age alone and reduce the variability in the data. And this is essentially the same thing that we're trying to do with Placebo. But instead of age, we're thinking about the placebo responsiveness profile of each patient as an innate characteristic, just like age. And if we can define this at the beginning of the study, we could apply a covariate that will reduce the variability in the data related to each patient's variable response to placebo, and that will allow us to better see the true efficacy of the drug. So to do that, we use machine learning to predict each patient's placebo responsiveness. And the major data that we use to do this are psychological data. So this could be patient personality, their beliefs, their expectations, their motivations for participating in the trial, the perception of the trial. And we know that this relationship between patient psychology and the placebo response is very complex. So there's many different factors, we call them features or facets, and each of these factors alone may not be able to distinguish which patients are placebo responders and not, but they must be considered, all these factors must be considered in relation to each other. So we use machine learning as a way to integrate all this information, determine which factors are important and their relative weights in a predictive model. And this is the basis of Placebell. So while this may be very sophisticated on the back end, for the user, it's extremely easy. It's just 3 steps. So obviously, step number 1, we're considering patient psychology. We need to assess patient psychology. And that information is used to predict each patient's placebo responsiveness using machine learning with a model that's defined before the analysis is initiated. So even though this model is based on machine learning, it's never learning during the analysis of any given trial. And then that results in the calculation of a score. That individual score we call the Placebell covariate. It's assigned to every patient, and it relates to that patient's predicted placebo responsiveness. So in a little bit more detail, first thing we need to do is assess patient psychology. And we do this using our MPSQ, which stands for Multidimensional Psychological Questionnaire. It's a proprietary questionnaire that's been developed by Cognivia that evaluates key aspects of patient psychology related to the placebo response. These things might be psychological traits, expectation, the patient's perception of the trial, we call that contextual factors, and things like social factors. So maybe the motivations for the patient participating in the trial and how they may be influenced by people in their social groups. All in all, the MPSQ takes about 30 to 35 minutes per patient. We decide for each trial how these different modules will be broken up at different visits to minimize the burden on the patient at any specific visit. And this questionnaire is self-administered. It's given only once in the trial. Then we use the information from the MPSQ along with other patient data that would normally be collected as part of the trial anyway, things like demographic characteristics, age and gender, for example, as inputs to the Placebell model that's been trained for every disease or maybe trained for specific endpoints. And that's used to calculate the score, the Placebell score, for each patient. So essentially, what that does is it puts each patient on the spectrum from placebo non-responder to strong placebo responder. And it puts them in context of every other patient in the trial. So now, just like age, we have a picture of the placebo responsiveness profile of every patient in the trial at the beginning of the trial. And then, just as we would with age, we can apply this Placebo score as a covariate. So essentially what that does is it reduces data variability. So when you reduce data variability, you can better distinguish the difference between drug-treated patients and placebo-treated patients. And that improves the ability to detect statistically significant differences. So it allows us to see the efficacy signal amid the noise that the placebo response may bring to the data. As a covariate approach, this is a very well-defined approach. It's calculated using data available at baseline, and as such, it follows the regulatory guidances put forth by the EMA and the FDA. And covariates in general are a very efficient way to increase study power, reduce the risk of trial failure, and ultimately could be used to reduce sample size. So I hope this helps to provide you some information about Placebell and how it works. And certainly, please feel free to reach out and contact us should you have any other questions. Thank you.